thank you to Andrew for inviting me here to speak this evening. I'm grateful for everything that he's done to bring me here. And I've worked for a number of institutions that are similar to the American Revolution Institute, and I know how much work that people in public programs do to put them on, the planning, the pre-planning, and the execution. So thank you, Andrew. Second, I'm thankful for the location. Here in Washington, D.C., at the American Revolution Institute, at the Society of the Cincinnati, we're all gathered here to discuss and engage with a group of people who are loyalists. The Institute is almost the perfect location to engage with this topic, especially as we look toward the various 250th anniversaries in 2024, 25, and 2026. Not only will those anniversaries commemorate events, people, or documents, which are well known, but perhaps loyalist documents, and indeed loyalists themselves, will receive further attention. In writing Unfriendly to Liberty, which is based on my Ph.D. dissertation, I always wanted the book to push the boundaries of what people think of loyalists and loyalism. And I hope that after this evening's event, some of you might want to look further into the topic and perhaps some of the people who are mentioned. My subject this evening is the origins of the American Revolution in New York City. I'll be discussing how the Delancey family and faction affected the causes and courses of the American Revolution in Manhattan from around 1765 to around 1775. Rather than looking at the origins of the revolution from a traditional standpoint, that is, those who became patriots or revolutionaries, I plan to look at those who became loyalists. Why did they become loyalists? Who were they? What motivated them? What made them loyalists? Were they any different to their patriot counterparts? What did they think of their opponents? First, though, it's important to understand, to give us all a sense of place. What was New York City like in the 18th century? Where were they? Unlike Boston, Philadelphia, and other urban centers in the US today, little remains of 18th century British New York City. By the mid-1760s, New York City was the second largest in colonial British North America. Its size was rivaling Philadelphia's and had passed Boston's. Its commerce, too, rivaled Philadelphia's and was well on the way to surpassing it. Some would even say that it was among the most important urban centers in the British Empire, second only to London. Militarily, it was significant as well. It was the center of British Army operations in North America, and the Army's commander-in-chief, Thomas Gage, lived there. Culturally, New York had the New York Society Library, which is still in existence today, King's College, which is now Columbia, the Moot Club, which is for lawyers, and various smaller political clubs where these people met to discuss and debate politics. It was a diverse city in many ways too. By the late 1760s, church steeples, not skyscrapers, punctured the city skyline. New York City was Manhattan, and Manhattan was New York City. Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and the Bronx were separated from Manhattan physically and civically. New York City was located on the tip of Manhattan Island, south of Chambers Street, and everything north of that was uptown or out of town, accessible really only by stagecoach or carriage. In today's New York, consider walking from, say, Francis Tavern to the New York Public Library on 42nd Street. It's quite a hike. Here we have 18th century New York City in the mid-1760s. And you can see that it's really just the bottom tip of Manhattan Island today. So if we just move forward, here's another image of it. It's colorized. You can see Delancey Square. That's in what is now the Lower East Side. And then this is a geo map that places the raster map that I just showed you on top of New York City. New York City has often been associated with loyalists and loyalism. Historians from as far back as the American Revolution have identified it as the center of loyalist activities, arguing that there were more loyalists there than anywhere else. This has, in turn, been reflected in what modern historians write about the city and how they situate it in the stories of the Revolution. It's often been relegated behind Boston and Philadelphia, and its most famous inhabitants overlooked, with the possible exception of Alexander Hamilton. Though, it should be said, his prominence occurred during and really after the Revolution, not before it. Neither Livingstone's, nor James Duane, nor Alexander McDougall, nor John Jay have the prominence of a Patrick Henry, a George Washington, a Thomas Jefferson, a John and Abigail Adams, and so on. And I'd guess that many people cannot even name a single New York City loyalist, though Samuel Seabury's brief inclusion in the musical Hamilton might have helped with that. Why was New York City a loyalist center? Was it a loyalist center? Who were the main protagonists? Were its patriots less committed? On 24 June 1776, John Adams, an opinionated lawyer from Massachusetts, wrote to his former law clerk, William Tudor. Adams, a prominent opponent of British imperial reform and an ardent rebel or revolutionary, was frustrated. Quote, "What is the reason that New York is still asleep or dead in politics and war?" Independence had not yet been declared, and Adams was worried. New Yorkers, Adams believed, should fall in line. Quote, "Must it always be so? Cannot the whole congregation of patriots and heroes inspire it with one generous sentiment? Have they no sense, no feeling, no passions?" New Yorkers were not mobilizing behind the war effort, but he could not work out why New Yorkers' politics did not match those from other colonies, especially his own. What confused Adams further was New Yorkers' history of opposing Parliament from the 1760s to mid-1770s. Adams knew what New Yorkers had done in the 1760s and 70s. When he first visited the city in 1774, that opposition was what originally piqued his interest, as well as the loud voices and fast talkers. Had something changed? Adams thought so. He wondered if there had been an atmospheric change, if there was, quote, anything in the air or soil that was, quote, unfriendly to the spirit of liberty. But nobody in colonial British America was predestined to become a loyalist or a patriot. And if there's one thing that I would like everybody to take home this evening, it's that nobody was predestined to become a loyalist or a patriot. It did not matter if they lived in New York City or New Hampshire or Charlottesville, Virginia. Colonists' respective journeys to the American Revolution, wherever they were influenced by a variety of factors: social, political, economic, historical, cultural. Some paths were similar, others overlapped. Friends and family members, no doubt, discussed the imperial crisis and relationship as it developed, and perhaps what that meant to them. It divided friends and family members, and it brought others closer together. The Delancey family played a critical role in Manhattan's path to revolution, and they were likely the target of Adams's annoyance. Later denigrated as loyalists or slandered as Tories, most historians have labeled them opportunistic and self-interested. They, the Delanceys, historians have argued, sought to protect and advance nobody but themselves. They sought and gained political power in New York, and in doing so, used everyday New Yorkers for their own purposes. They were selfish, arrogant, out of touch, and elitist. So historians have said. Now, this interpretation generally depicts loyalists as what you see on the big screen. They've got the red coats, they're all quite posh, they've all got very proper English-sounding accents, but as I argue, that was not the case in New York. James Delancey, for example, was the leader of the faction, and the family bearing his name has been forgotten or written out of histories. His family used to own Francis Tavern, and indeed much of what is now the Lower East Side. And then you think of, if you're ever in Lower Manhattan, think of Delancey Street. Educated at Eton, Cambridge, and the Inner Temple at London's Inns of Court, Delancey later served as an aide-de-camp to James Abercrombie during the French and Indian War. Delancey didn't leave many papers behind. Now, this is a common theme for prominent loyalists in the American Revolution. They didn't leave many papers behind. For Delancey, it's a few boxes at the New York Historical Society, a collection of family papers at the Museum of the City of New York, and that's about it. This, as well as his loyalism, has affected how he has been interpreted. Harvard historian and New Yorker staff writer Joe Lepore has written about, quote, what gets saved, what gets lost, what gets forgotten, and what the consequences are. That was in her biography of Jane Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's sister. But this is similar for James Delancey and thousands of other loyalists. What papers of theirs got saved? What got destroyed? Who saved it? Why would they save it? In short, for people like Delancey, they were loyalists, and that was that. Papers or not, it did not matter. However, this long-standing interpretation generally presents the American Revolution in binary terms. And by that, I mean that New Yorkers or colonists were either patriots or loyalists, that they were one or the other long before shots were fired at Lexington or Concord. This interpretation generally relegates the Delanceys and their associates and loyalists to caricature, and most people in New York now only recognize the name by the street on the Lower East Side. Loyalists, in other words, were bad. They were against New Yorkers and indeed all colonist rights and liberties. And they were similar to people like Samuel Seabury and Hamilton, Anglican ministers aloof, altogether disconnected from the everyday realities of life in New York City, and indeed colonial British North America. What this interpretation overlooks, however, are the considerable contributions that the Delanceys and other future loyalists made not only to popular political culture in Manhattan, but the coming of the Revolution and the history of the early United States. My view is that historians and the public should reconsider the origins of the Revolution without thinking toward the good guys or the bad guys in 1775 and beyond. And through an examination of the Delancey's political and social behavior prior to and shortly into the Revolutionary War, we're better able to understand their eventual loyalism and the loyalism of their associates. James Delancey burst onto the popular political scene during the Stamp Act crisis of 1765. The Stamp Act is often described or represented as the first step that colonists took toward revolution or independence. Historians may now disagree what the causes of the revolution were, but they are in almost near unanimous agreement about the Stamp Act's role in mobilizing patriots. Contemporary historians of revolutionary America and of New York often framed it this way. Of the Stamp Act, historian Mercy Otis Warren wrote, quote, "It was the first innovation that gave a general alarm throughout the continent." The Stamp Act, Warren and other contemporary historians remembered, changed how colonists understood their relationship with Britain. Such discontent toward Parliament and toward Britain had not been articulated in colonial British America before. For historians then and now, it provides a comfortable starting point for the imperial crisis in the march toward independence. Indeed, almost all historians have stuck with the neat temporal organization the Stamp Act provides. It offers a neat 10-year period in which colonists went from colonists to patriots, from Britons to Americans. The Stamp Act was part of a broader maxim of imperial reforms when Parliament attempted to reorient how it managed and controlled the British Empire. It was intended to introduce more than 50 duties on documents that were used in everyday life, including those for clearing ships, licensing attorneys, indentures, contracts, bills, liquor licenses, playing cards, land documents, as well as all types of printed materials, almanacs, newspapers, broadsides, pamphlets, a lot of stuff. The Act, which would be enforced from November 1st, 1765, was designed to lower expenditures and pay down the British national debt. Its wide-ranging reach all but ensured it would have a monumental effect on the economy. As one Delanceyite wrote, David Clarkson, it was a tax on, quote, everything. And with a tax on everything, the Stamp Act was wildly unpopular. The arrival of stamps in Manhattan on the 23rd of October, 1765, mobilized elite and non-elite New Yorkers in opposition. Placards were placed in city coffee houses that threatened any who used, quote, stamped paper. Just over a week later, James Delancey called a meeting in the assembly room at George Burns's City Arms Tavern. In Burns's tavern, over 200 attendees discussed, quote, what was necessary to be done about the Stamp Act. Most of the attendees were merchants, just like Delancey. And after long, difficult discussions, they determined in 4 resolutions that a trade boycott would be the most effective and efficient way to protest. As the attendees left Burns's tavern, youths and sailors, old and young, rushed toward them, eagerly awaiting news of what had transpired. But they were left disappointed. Resolutions, however effective, would not stop the Stamp Act going into effect a few days later. They sought action, not words, and they wanted to ensure that the new duties were not enforced on November 1st. Together, the sailors, youths, and those they were able to mobilize marched throughout Lower Manhattan. They smashed streetlights and windows in, as one New Yorker reported, quote, a mobbish manner. The exuberance of those left disappointed at the Burns Tavern meeting captured New Yorkers' urgency. It showed the lengths that they were willing to go to show their opposition to the Stamp Act. Delancey, an intelligent, street-smart political operative, recognized the distress. In fact, it's possible that he contributed to it. Delancey was not just a member, but he was also among the leaders of a popular extra-institutional group that was known as the Sons of Liberty. The Liberty Boys, as they were also known, are often held up as proto-revolutionaries, groups of people who were somehow predestined to become patriots in the American Revolution. Historian Ed Countryman has described them as, quote, the Revolution's popular leadership. Tim Breen labeled them, quote, as true patriots. Patriots were Sons of Liberty. People who became loyalists were not. But Delancey, a popular motivational figure who was described by one onlooker as, quote, among the Sons of Liberty, became a loyalist. And so too did a considerable portion of the leaders of New York's Liberty Boys, including, for instance, Edward Late, Charles Nicholl, and Joseph Alacoque, all of whom were Delancey's colleagues and political associates. The Sons of Liberty, moreover, were not entirely, quote, plain-spoken, self-taught, self-made men, as other historians have described them. Instead, in at least one urban center, they were led by one of the most educated men in the colonies and someone who later became a loyalist. What happened during the Stamp Act riots is well known. The participation of future loyalists is not, but future or would-be loyalists' participation in New York City's popular political culture was not a one-off, nor was their opposition to Parliament. Indeed, the Delanceys and their associates, most of whom became loyalists, maintained consistent opposition to Parliament's attempted reorientation of the British Empire from 1765 until 1775. And from 1768 onward, they were able to present a more coherent opposition than those who became patriots. Now, on the screen right now, we have a screenshot from Wikipedia, and these list the New York's members of the Sons of Liberty. So you'll see Joseph Alacoque, he was a Delanceyite, he became a loyalist. Edward Nicholl as well, so did Charles Nicholl too. Isaac Sears and John Lamb. These people are patriots who are probably well known to people here. They, up until about 1769, 1770, they were associated with the Delanceys. They were not associated with people who became patriots. They were associated with James Delancey and his family and faction. Now here on the screen, we have a quote from James Delancey in writing a letter to the Marquis of Rockingham. And in this letter, you see that he's proposing an American Parliament, Say, what say you to an American parliament only to meddle with supplies, so trade? Don't startle at an American parliament. Your colonies will exhaust you. And if you have a look at the date, the 8th of November, 1765, that's just shortly after the Stamp Act was due to go into effect. So here we have 10 years before 1775, James Delancey, who goes on to become a loyalist, proposing an American parliament. Now, you might say that he's doing this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, which is probably true, but this sort of running theme about giving the colonies authority, their own autonomy, is a running theme in his correspondence with the Marquess of Rockingham. In 1768, James Delancey and two of his associates, Jacob Walton, James Jauncey, were elected to the New York Assembly. More importantly, though, the way they were elected reoriented popular politics in Manhattan. Put simply, like today, they sought as many voters as possible from across the religious, cultural, and social spectrums. To put their goals into action, the Delanceys used the city's comparatively well-developed print trade. In 1768, 3 weekly newspapers appeared: John Holt's New York Journal, Hugh Gaines' New York Gazette and the Weekly Mercury, and James Parker's New York Gazette or the Weekly Postboy. And by working with the city's printers, they monopolized the weekly news cycles, attracting support, creating associational bonds, putting their names in front of as many New Yorkers as possible. They advertised their candidacies, which their opponents did not do, and published many pieces that appealed to New Yorkers of all ranks. They also commissioned a pamphlet, a range of broadsides, and a series of short, focused cards that described their opponents, some of whom were lawyers, as entirely unsuited for political office because they were lawyers. For instance, many of the Delanceyites, including all of those who were on the ticket, James Delancey, James Jauncey, and Jacob Walton, were merchants. And since New York was a commercial, enterprising city, they argued, quote, "The good people of this city are supported by trade and merchants." What I consider a little bit ironic is that James Delancey was educated at the Inns of Court, becomes a merchant. So as merchants in a mercantile city, they showed that they were the people who would advance New Yorkers' interests. They argued persuasively that they offered economic independence that, in turn, would advance the public good and improve the political economy of New York City, how economic and political institutions, organizations, and systems interacted. Their opponents, on the other hand, neither advertised their candidacies nor printed comparable election materials of their own. Instead, they relied on traditional modes of political mobilization: deference, word of mouth, or handwritten scraps of information. The Delanceys also took advantage of the city's taverns. They used their city's tavern culture of sociability to mobilize support, holding regular meetings in George Burns's and Benjamin Stout's taverns. They also placed frequent advertisements in the press to ensure that their supporters were aware of and attended their events. They did not specify any requirements. Any white male could attend, and when they got there, they were greeted with long tables covered with a wide array of alcoholic beverages and food. It's a lot of booze. As each person sat down, huddled up to one another, drinks and conversation flowed. When the event was over, the Delanceys paid for everything. So here we have an example of one bill from Benjamin Stout. This is at the New York Historical Society and James Delancey's papers. So events such as this were popular in the election campaign. In one bill, the one shown here, James Delancey was charged for 248 meals, 134 bottles of wine, over 106 double bowls of punch, 117 mugs of beer and cider, and an assortment of other drinks for events that ran Monday through Friday in the run-up to the election. The Delanceys were determined to mobilize as many voters as possible, and it worked. All the Delancey candidates were elected. If we just go back a slide, here are 2 examples of the cards that were handed out or left on tables in coffee houses and taverns. These are the size of a playing card. So you imagine a deck of cards, so they can be handed around. And sometimes on the back of those, there were an actual playing card. These are the Library Company of Philadelphia. And you'll see the quote there from Rev. Charles Ingalls of Trinity Church, writing of the Delancey's opponents, who were the Livingston family and faction. He said they were outwrote as well as outvoted. The next year, in 1769, during another round of elections and electioneering, the Delanceys consolidated their legislative clout by gaining control of all of the city and county seats. To do this, they incorporated many of the same tactics as they did in 1768, a variety of printed materials, tavern events. They best represented New York City's population and were the only legitimate candidates who could advance and protect their interests. As merchants in a mercantile city, they would lead New York City forward on its path to becoming the most important city in the British Empire, surpassing Boston and Philadelphia and rivaling London. New Yorkers, in other words, had to vote for them. If they didn't, they were voting against the public good and against their interests. And New Yorkers did vote for them. As Peter R. Livingston lamented in 1769, they had, quote, too much power over our common people. And as one newspaper reported, the Delanceys were New York's, quote, sons of freedom. What's equally important are the people who voted for the Delanceys in both of these elections. A majority of Delancey voters were loyalists in the American Revolution. Dutch, English, Scottish, Irish New Yorkers, and more. Carpenters, shoemakers, tailors, goldsmiths, silversmiths, merchants, gentlemen, lawyers, and more. Their voters represented the city's diversity. This isn't to say, however, that because their voters became loyalists, they left New York after the Revolution and never returned. Far from it. A considerable portion of the Delancey's voters who were loyalists remained in the city in 1783. But after the 1769 election, an opponent to the Delanceys emerges in New York City. Around a year after the Delanceys' consolidation of power in the New York Assembly, politics in the city was more partisan than it had been during the elections, largely thanks to the emergence and rise of a Scottish radical, Alexander MacDougall, who organized a coherent, popular association that opposed the Delanceys and their politics. MacDougall opposed the Assembly's appropriation of money to fund the quartering of British troops and how assemblymen shut people out of a viewing chamber to get that legislation across the line. MacDougall anonymously authored a fierce broadside in which he criticized the Delanceys and their supposed relationship with the much-hated colonial governor Cadwallader Colden. MacDougall was eventually arrested and imprisoned for this broadside, mobilizing large numbers of people both for him and against the Delanceys. A paper war emerged in Manhattan's press as Delanceyites and MacDougallites argued who was right and who was wrong. The Delanceys labeled MacDougall a traitor. MacDougall supporters declared that Delanceys were working against the public good and had thus shown themselves to be self-interested, corrupt politicians. The Delanceys, MacDougall alleged, were not working for the people or the city after all. They were working for themselves and Cadwallader Colden. The people who mobilized to MacDougall and stuck with the Delanceys remained with their respective groups until 1775 and beyond. That is to say, those who supported MacDougall mostly became patriots. Those who supported the Delanceys became loyalists. Now, this is 1770. The lines in the sand are drawn now, and they remain that way until 1775. Most historians, old and comparatively new, have argued that the Delanceys were politicians who sought only to advance themselves. This interpretation understates and frankly almost entirely overlooks the Delanceys' economic and ideological vision for Manhattan. They were, above all, New Yorkers. They sought to make money, of course, but they wanted to invest money back into the city economy and promote New Yorkers' economic and financial well-being. Just like New Yorkers today, they promoted the exchange of capital inside and outside of the city and saw economic advancement and security as the surest means to advance and eventually protect the public good. The Delanceys weren't Tories like the Stuart Jacobites. They, like all of the people who became revolutionaries, were Whigs. They opposed the Townshend duties, the Tea Act, and the Coercive Acts, and toward the end of the 1760s, just as their fall from popular grace was meant to happen, James Delancey wrote to the former British Prime Minister, the Marquis of Rockingham, the person who headed the ministry that repealed the Stamp Act, with a solution. In a letter housed at the Sheffield City Archives, in a collection almost entirely overlooked by historians, Delancey outlined his and his faction's guiding principle, and it was the pursuit of, quote, life, liberty, and commerce. Now, it was in another letter that I've already showed you that Delancey proposed his American Parliament. Don't startle at a Parliament in America, he told Rockingham. And the main objective for Delancey's Parliament was to enable the continued economic development of the colonies, from which colonists would, quote, support the government with all the trappings and splendor. For Delancey and his associates, their politics was intertwined with their ideological commitment to republicanism, as well as their allegiance to Britain. Together, they were, quote, the friends of liberty and trade. Now, to talk a little bit more about Alexander McDougall, I think he's probably one of the most overlooked patriots of the entire American Revolution. His contributions prior to the Revolution are unrivaled by anyone else who ends up becoming a patriot. Now, part of this is because the papers that he left behind are comparatively few in number. It's just 2 boxes at the New York Historical Society. Now, he appears in other collections all over the place, but that is the main corpus of his materials. And I think that's why he has been largely overlooked. But he really comes on the scene in 1769 and 1770 and is a thorn in the Delancey's side. So the Delanceys were the friends of liberty and trade. They worked for, quote, life, liberty, and commerce. They put these principles into practice too. They put them into action. In April 1768, they were instrumental in the establishment of the New York Chamber of Commerce, which still exists today. The purpose of the chamber, which was the first in the colonies, was, quote, promoting and encouraging commerce, supporting industry, adjusting disputes relative to trade and navigation, and procuring such laws and regulations as may be found necessary for the benefit in trade in general. The Delancey's vision for the city was publicly articulated through the Chamber of Commerce's seal, which is what you can see here. It's likely that the Chamber drew inspiration for its seal from Joseph Spence's Polymetis, which was first published in London in 1747. Polymetis contained detailed descriptions and engravings of Roman gods and goddesses. So Mercury, the god of shopkeepers and tradesmen, features prominently on the Chamber's seal. His catechist and cornucopia symbolize peace and plenty, quote, 2 of the principal ingredients of happiness. The use of the rising sun in the background was also symbolic. It's an allegorical reference to the dawn. It represented a new beginning, the hope and potential of the Chamber of Commerce and what it could bring to New York moving forward. Now, the Chamber of Commerce was incorporated in 1770, shortly after McDougall comes onto the scene and presents opposition to the Delanceys. And the Chamber's leadership was almost entirely composed of Delanceyites. It was almost entirely composed of people who became loyalists in the American Revolution. Its first presidents were all Delanceys: John Kruger, Hugh Wallace, Elias de Brosses, Henry White, Theophylact Bash, William Walton, all Delanceys. Its vice presidents and secretaries, including Anthony Van Dam, were Delanceyites, and so too were most of its members. They promoted financial investment in the city that would, in turn, translate into further economic opportunities in new industries and sectors that New Yorkers could take advantage of. So here is another one that the Delanceys helped establish, the Marine Society, which is also available today, and they also filled the seal with symbolic meaning. The Delanceys represented and advocated for a type of political economy to secure the future of Manhattan. They advocated for consumption-based economic growth. As James Delancey told Rockingham, life, liberty, and commerce guided their vision for Manhattan, and he and his associates advocated this viewpoint during the non-importation crisis of 1770, as well as the crises surrounding the Tea Act, the Coercive Acts, and the First and Second Continental Congresses. At each event, the Delanceys took the lead in dictating New Yorkers' response to crisis after it presented itself. They attempted to shape the city's and the colonies' institutional and popular responses to Parliament's measures. But with each crisis, partisanship worsened and New Yorkers grew further apart. So here we have some of the prominent Delanceites who became loyalists, McDougalites who became revolutionaries. So you have James Delancey, Jacob Walton, people who I've mentioned already. And we also have George Brewerton, Jr. and Sr., father and son, and then Frederick Rhinelander, his family, the Late family, the Nickel family. On the other side, we have Isaac Sears, John Lamb, John Holt, who's the printer who I mentioned earlier, then people like Hugh Hughes, Gresham Mott, John Moran Scott, and some of the Livingstons. What's very interesting is when Holt, Lamb, and Sears, they split with the Delanceys in 1769 over the quartering of British troops. The Delanceys, in turn, they say, well, we met with Isaac Sears, and Sears said that if there was, it's kind of, they attached a bill, something to the legislation to get it through, that was issuing money into New York's economy. It was about £120,000. Sears said if they had done that, if they did that, New Yorkers would be happy because money would be injected into the economy. So the Delanceys, they went ahead with that, and it didn't quite work out how they hoped. But they said that they had spoken to Sears, and that is what Sears had recommended. But Sears and Lamb and John Holt broke from them in 1769, and they stayed apart. Although both were Whigs and supported republicanism, they held competing interpretations of New York's place within the British Empire. Whereas the Delanceys were moderate or establishment Whigs, McDougalites were radicals, and some New Yorkers who initially sided or worked with the Delanceys shifted or defected to the McDougalites. For them, McDougall's ideology, his politics, better represented their views. Some New Yorkers went in the opposite direction toward the Delanceys. Now, one historian has written that, quote, competing ideologies structured politics throughout the 18th century British Empire. So competing ideologies structured politics throughout the 18th century British Empire. This is certainly the case in 18th century New York City. So here we have on the screen, you have some moderate establishment Whigs. These are the Delancey's, and they're sort of people who are similar to them in Britain or Rockingham or Edmund Burke, whereas for McDougall, John Wilkes, Isaac Barry, William Pitt the Elder. Ultimately, for James Delancey and many of his supporters, their ideas and interests, their political economy, and their partisanship determined their allegiance during the American Revolution. They had joined the Delanceys in 1765. They had reinforced their support and reinforced their bonds in 1768 and 1769, and that continued in 1770 onward. Frederick Rhinelander, a merchant who operated a store on Burling Slip, captures the Delanceyite approach well. Rhinelander, whose family remain in and around New York today, some in Massachusetts, dined with the Delanceys on numerous occasions and supported their measures and actions in opposing the Tea and Coercive Acts. Quote, the right of Parliament to tax this country, Rhinelander wrote in early 1775, we all disapprove of. Rhinelander had been involved in popular politics in Manhattan for close to a decade, and he appreciated that it had degraded into a bitter factional contest. McDougall, by 1774 and 75, was going to upset and possibly overthrow New York's democratically elected government. MacDougall, excuse me, Rhinelander believed, sought to usurp its legitimate power. It was MacDougall and his associates. It was MacDougall and those who became patriots who were, quote, the American demagogues, not the Delanceys or their supporters. And so Rhinelander turned to the British. Quote, if this province ever fights, Rhinelander wrote in January 75, it will be for the king. Rhinelander and his associates would do whatever it took to, quote, counteract MacDougall and his supporters. For Rhinelander, as for the Delanceys, they were loyalists. Loyalists not only to George III in Parliament, who they legitimately believed would address their grievances, as had happened before, but they were also loyalists to New York City and to one another. They believed MacDougall and his supporters threatened the city. Of course, things did not go to plan for James Delancey or many of his supporters. So here we have a quote from Rhinelander in 75. We have a small political club. I mentioned earlier that there were political clubs in New York City. Rhinelander and many Delanceyites were member of the old Amicable Society. And in 1775, they meet up again to talk about politics. Almost everybody in that group becomes a loyalist in the revolution. There's a list of members at the New York Public Library on 42nd Street. So our highest wish is for a speedy reconciliation. If this province ever fights, it will be for the king. We must enlarge the club and meet frequently during the assembly sessions so that we may be better enabled to counteract the Blues. The Blues are MacDougall and his associates. One of the main things for the Delanceyites and their supporters was the assembly. They had voted for the Delanceys in 1768 and 1769. They were their legitimate representatives. They should represent their interest in Parliament, not MacDougall or MacDougall's associates, who were not elected. Here we have another quote for a Delanceyite called William Late. Now, the Late family also remained in New York City after the Revolution. So I cannot with some allow the Parliament every power, for it does not to me seem reasonable that the internal regulation of this country, taxes, and both with respect to taxation and police, should be within their jurisdiction. So here you have loyalists in Late and loyalists in Rhinelander outlining their opposition to Parliament's reorientation of the British Empire. That's not something that often happens in the literature on the Revolution. Our assembly, thank heaven, have pretty nearly pursued what you recommended. Now he's writing to an Anglican minister called John Bardell. They have not adopted the proceedings of Congress, but have proceeded on their own bottom. So this captures what I was saying earlier. The Assembly are going to oppose Parliament. When the First Continental Congress meets, the New York Assembly doesn't approve or adopt their proceedings. They want to go their own way. And that's what eventually leads to Alexander MacDougall and his associates essentially setting up their own government. Here, we have two newspapers, two very different visions of and for New York City. Now, the one on the bottom, I imagine the snake is well known to everybody here. And that's from John Holt's New York Journal with the General Advertiser. And on top, it's Rivington's New York Gazetteer. Now, what's most interesting is the masthead on each. So the image in each is what's most interesting here. So Holt and Rivington go through changes in 1774 to articulate their viewpoints. So Holt, he starts off with the Royal Coat of Arms, and then he eventually shifts to the Unite or Die. Now, this is eventually adopted in Massachusetts as well by Isaiah Thomas, and it's well known for him, but Holt did it first, and Holt doesn't often get the credit for that. Now, Rivington's masthead used to be a ship sailing on the horizon to represent New York City as a mercantile city. He's changed it to the Royal Coat of Arms. So you can see two different views for New York's place in the British Empire. Holt is advocating that the colonies must unite or die, using Benjamin Franklin's image. Rivington is adopting what some would say is a loyalist perspective. The Royal Coat of Arms, that's where we should go. Now, when the opportunity came, many Delancey signed loyalist petitions and declarations, and they took the oath of allegiance when it was offered. Frederick Rhinelander, for instance, signed every loyalist document that I've been able to find in my research. He signed 2 large Loyalist declarations that are at the New York Historical Society, and he took the oath of allegiance when it was offered in 1777. William Late did the same. James Delancey, however, signed no Loyalist petition or declaration that I could find because he wasn't in New York City when they were offered. Why? Some New Yorkers fled the city when it wasn't under British rule. They returned to it when it was. Some left in the spring of 1775, hoping to resolve colonial issues across the Atlantic, and that's what James Delancey did. He sailed for Britain in the spring of 1775 with a goal to personally petition Parliament, prominent MPs, and politicians, including Edmund Burke, New York's agent in Parliament, and Rockingham. Now, Delancey left New York City thinking he would return. He was convinced he would return. He would not. He never came back. Instead, his uncle, Oliver Delancey, eventually organized and led a Loyalist provincial regiment and fought in the conflict. All of the Delancey family estates were confiscated and sold off, and James Delancey was essentially declared an enemy of the state. Now, Delancey was no enemy of the state. He had a competing vision for New York City, one that included a self-governing American Parliament that was not too dissimilar to the Continental Congress. He never advocated independence, but by 1775, nobody had that view. Even though he left the city, the political association or faction that bore his name had successfully incorporated and then defended the same political economic vision that they had developed in the 1760s and 1770s. Life, liberty, and commerce worked for them after the Revolutionary War, as it worked for many Delanceites and Loyalists throughout the remainder of the 18th century and beyond. And even if many of the buildings they occupied or frequented aren't there today, the signs of their presence in New York are. The Chamber of Commerce, Francis Tavern, Delancey Street, the Marine Society, New York City's place in not just the United States, but the world. Now, take someone like Frederick Rhinelander. Rhinelander signed every Loyalist document that I've been able to find. He left the city in 1775 and would only return in 1776 after the British occupation had started. Rhinelander is personally mentioned in the papers of George Washington as a Loyalist. After the Revolution, Rhinelander and his family stayed. They didn't leave. They didn't go to Canada or to Britain. They stayed in New York and re-established themselves, and they became among the most prominent members and families in all of New York. By the early 1800s, they were associating with the Astor family, and when Rhinelander died in the early 1800s, obituaries were published in numerous newspapers. None of them highlighted his loyalism in the Revolution. The Late family, they also stayed. Some Delancey members, they stayed as well, but some left. The Lowe family is a good example. Now, Isaac Lowe, who was a member of the Continental Congress, he left and he moved to London. He had a very hard time adjusting to his new life in London. His brother, Nicholas, stayed, and they corresponded. Isaac kind of spoke about how the struggles he was having trying to adopt to life in London, whereas Nicholas was buying up estates that had been confiscated. But they kept in touch, and Nicholas kept advocating and advancing the Delancey approach, life, liberty, and commerce. Of course, this isn't to say that Loyalists were responsible for it all, or New Yorkers who became Loyalists were responsible for New York City's growth in the 18th century. They weren't. Consider the contributions of other New Yorkers, those who became revolutionaries. John Jay, who was a Delanceyite until very late in the game, Alexander McDougall, William Livingston, and others. What I argue in Unfriendly to Liberty, and what I've argued tonight, is that New York City's Loyalists made substantial contributions to the city's political and economic development. They also contributed to the origins of American political practice, and those people and their stories are often left out of traditional narratives. Now, I, for one, would like to see similar work in other urban centers. And that work can begin with a simple question. Who are they? Who were Newport's Loyalists? Who were Philadelphia's Loyalists? Who were Williamsburg's Loyalists? By taking the question of who and exploring the why, we can better understand how elites and non-elites interacted socially, politically, and economically in the run-up to 1775. And one of the things that the Delanceys did, and they did so well, is they interacted with non-elites. Non-elites interacted with elites throughout the imperial crisis. They formed associational bonds and they stayed together. People formed relationships because of their political connections to the Delanceys. They eventually ended up buying land in upstate New York. They bought vessels together. They intermarried. They developed kinship networks, or they joined political clubs like the Amicable Society. With various 250th anniversaries on the horizon, I'm ready to welcome that kind of scholarship and to integrate loyalists more fully into the study of the American Revolution. Oh, thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to give it my best shot.
Yes, when you were talking about the Delanceys winning elections, I was wondering what the suffrage was like at that time. It was male, undoubtedly. But what percentage of the male population could vote? Do you know?
Now, sort of being eligible to vote in Manhattan was quite broad in comparison to other urban centers. You had to be a male, and you had to be either a freeman or a freeholder. So you had to either own a certain portion of land or purchase it for £40. And in that election, in 1776-75, the population was about 25,000, and there was about maybe about 1,200 voters. And what's quite interesting about the elections in 68 and 69 is that the poll lists have been published. So you can see who voted for who. And that's how I was able to determine their paths to sort of revolution. Voters could vote up to 4 times for multiple candidates, and it was done in like an open air setting like this. So if I was a candidate, some of you might say, put your arm up and say, yes, you can vote for me. And someone else would vote for other people as well. So it was quite broad, but in comparison to the whole city, it's still a very narrow percentage of it, like just over 1,000 voters.
Thank you.
You mentioned John Jay as being someone who was originally a Delanceyite and ultimately saw the light, if I can say it that way. Were there trigger points that you can point to? Did they just ultimately say the king went too far, or there were certain, tortures, or they saw the prison ships, on the East River, or what were some of the reasons why New Yorkers left the Loyalist movement and decided? And then also, what condition did they leave New York in when Washington arrived?
Good questions. John Jay is a great example. In the William Late letter that he writes to John Bardell, this is in the National Archives in Kew, just outside London, and it's in a box that John Bardell submitted as evidence of his loyalism. So it's not in very good condition. It's a box that's just full of random papers. And in that letter, William Late describes Jay as he's turned a blueskin. And for him, it starts in 1775. And it's to do with the First Continental Congress, when the Assembly don't adopt the proceedings of Congress or agree to send more representatives to the second. That's a turning point for many people, including someone like John Jay. For people like Isaac Sears and John Lamb and Holt, that occurs before, in 1770, when Alexander McDougall is imprisoned, when the Assembly locks people out of the viewing chamber so they can't see them talking about the Quartering Act. That's a shifting point for them. And when McDougall is actually imprisoned, he becomes the John Wilkes of America. And so John Wilkes is associated with the number 45 for the North Britain. Suddenly things start turning up in front of McDougall's jail cell with 45 somethings, 45 like pounds of meat or 45 bottles of wine, things like that. And McDougall actually mobilizes support to him rather than sort of support being left from the Delancey. So he attracts people to his cause. The Delancey sort of helped give him a little nudge. That is a key moment very early in the conflict for a lot of people, or the crisis. It gets worse when James Delancey leaves, because there's a power vacuum. Like he's the kind of the leader of his family and faction. When he leaves, nobody really takes his place. And then McDougall and his associates like Isaac Sears and John Lamb, they're very, very good at mobilizing support and welcoming people to their cause. And if you're not welcome to their cause, they'll bring you to it, and they will pretty much force you to it. There are a few examples. People in New York are forced to sign things. They're forced to sign the Continental Association. Now, this isn't just people who became patriots who did that. When the British occupation starts in New York, people are forced to sign loyalist petitions as well, especially the Oath of Allegiance. Like, if you can imagine a very large professional army on your doorstep, you're going to take the Oath of Allegiance, otherwise things might be difficult for you. And that was especially common on Long Island when the Oath of Allegiance was offered there. Now, when sort of people left New York, they didn't destroy it or anything like that. They kind of just abandoned where they were. Many people went to New Jersey in what became the English neighborhood in Bergen County. When Washington leaves, I would point you toward Benjamin Carp's new book on the fire in New York, about what happens there, because he has some interesting thoughts on what happened there, about how the Patriots left New York. So I'd take a look at that, but they didn't do anything like that. But I really, Ben Carp's book is very good, so I'd recommend that.
Did Delancey ever have a role in the committees of correspondence that wrote to each other in the colonies?
Not in an official capacity in the way that someone like Alexander McDougall and Isaac Sears did, because they're writing to Sam Adams in 1774 about getting things going and starting a Continental Congress. And in Samuel Adams's papers, which are available online at the New York Public Library, you can see the letter in which McDougall and Sears propose a Continental Congress. Now, James Delancey and his associates, they go on committees that are local to New York City. When the assembly is out of session, committees of 25 people are formed, then a committee of 50 people are formed, then 51, then 60, then 100. And there are various percentages of the Delancey makeup on that, but that's kind of local. And that they have some interactions with other colonies, but nothing on the level of, say, like Alexander McDougall does, nothing like that. Because what I think is that they're hyper-focused on the local. Like, they really focus on New York City and New York, whereas someone like McDougall and Patriots, they start to think broader, and they start to develop what becomes a new national identity. Is they're ready to work with their people in Massachusetts or people in Connecticut or Virginia. For Delancey and his associates, it's all about New York City.
All right, well, I'm going to shift over to Zoom here because we do have some attendees that have a few questions for you. The first being, did Delancey's loyalist views significantly influence people in other colonies?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Did Delancey's loyalist views significantly influence people in other colonies?
Not really. Like, I haven't found much evidence of the way that the Delanceys behave as doing anything but encouraging patriotism in other colonies, because people saw, like, these are the most prominent people in the assembly. In other colonies, like in Massachusetts, they're working for getting the coercive acts repealed, and they want to work with the Continental Congress. New Yorkers kind of ostracize themselves a little bit, and in that way, the Delanceys could be, you could say that they're kind of narrow-minded and myopic, that they're focusing on sorting things out themselves. Perhaps they should have worked with other colonies to try and mobilize support. But that's something that historians have argued about the Loyalist movement in general, is that there was no leadership. Someone like James Delancey might have been able to provide that leadership if he had not left, but he leaves. And then the people who remain in New York that could become leaders, someone like Miles Cooper, he also leaves. Miles Cooper was president of King's College. He leaves. He's an Anglican minister, so his support is only ever going to be so much. If Delancey had been able to mobilize support in other colonies, the Loyalist movement might have been larger than it was. They did have some interactions with Pennsylvania. His uncle Oliver was married to Phila Franks, who is Pennsylvania family, but nothing to the extent that McDougall was able to mobilize support in, say, Massachusetts. Because when I mentioned briefly John Adams's visit to New York when he's on his way to the Continental Congress, and this is something that I've been very interested in for a very long time, is that he stays in New York longer than anywhere else on his entire trip. And that when he comes into the city, he's almost immediately greeted by MacDougall and his supporters. And I thought, this is interesting. And then what happens is MacDougall and his Isaac Sears and John Warren Scott, they essentially show Adams around, and like they want to be seen as cooperating and working with one another. So they go to taverns and they go to coffee houses, and this is all recorded in John Adams's diary, which is available online as part of the Adams Papers. And Adams maintains this diary primarily for the benefit of his wife, Abigail, because they're not corresponding at this time. So he writes down everybody who he met. He writes down where he went, and it's MacDougall took me here, MacDougall took me there. We went out of town to John Warren Scott's house, and it was great. And he's exhausted by the end of it. And it's in that Adams's diary when he has that famous quote about New Yorkers speaking very loud, very fast, and all together. That point there, like MacDougall and Adams are working together. MacDougall, you don't really find out what they spoke about, only a little bit, but Adams respects them. And when the Continental Congress takes place, the first one, MacDougall isn't a member, he's not a delegate, but he goes to Philadelphia and he's there briefly. But so he does the out of doors politics in taverns, trying to persuade people in that way. And that's how he builds support, intercolonial support, something that the Loyalists never really did. And that's how you end up, when the British come, the British Army come, they rely primarily or almost exclusively on them, rather than working together in the same way that colonists did who became patriots.
Great, thank you. And then we have another attendee who asked 2 questions. So I'm going to go one by one here. The first one is, can you speak to those who were patriots and cashiered out and became loyalists?
Patriots who became loyalists?
Yes.
This is a complicated one. So I'll start.
We have all night. Go ahead.
When I started this project, I started at the end, and what I mean by that is I identified lists of loyalists, and I wanted to find out how they became loyalists. Why did these people eventually become loyalists in the revolution? So I have a list of nearly 10,000 people, and it was loyalist oaths, declarations, and petitions from all over New York. And on this list are people who I know were from patriot families. So someone like Peter Van Brew Livingston of the Livingston family, Peter Van Brew Livingston Jr. signed it. And why did he sign it? He was probably because he was in New York City when the British offered the oath of allegiance. That's one example of the complicated nature of the kind of documents that I'm working with, is that was this person really a loyalist, or was he just doing it to get by? And the same can be, you can flip it on its head and say, are they patriots or not? In terms of people who sort of flipped radically, there in my research, there's nobody that offers like a great example of that. They staked their sort of line in the sand very early on and didn't do the type of switch that Isaac Sears did, or John Lamb did, or John Holt did. They kind of stayed the course. But people who I know are patriots signed loyalist documents, and vice versa. And I've written about that elsewhere, is that people who signed the Continental Association would later sign a loyalist petition and document and explain in a letter that they were forced to do that because the British Army were behind them. That just, it's the complicated nature of allegiance and identity. Like, what are you going to do to get by? Are you going to sign this document, or are you going to be essentially beaten up by the British Army? That you're probably going to sign the document. But I wish there was sort of a prominent, a Benedict Arnold type example of someone switching like that, but I don't have one. Maybe one, if anyone has anyone, can send them my way.
Very good. And the second question is 2-part series here. Can you also speak to Trinity Church being a hotbed for loyalists in New York City?
Yeah. So Trinity Church is one of the it has an amazing array of online materials available. So you can have marriage records, baptismal records, and I mined those a lot in researching and writing this book, because I wanted to explore the religious makeup of New York's loyalist population. Now, historians have argued that most loyalists were Anglican. That's what I found. I found that most of the loyalists that I identified, it was a small percentage, they were Anglican. And you have prominent Anglican ministers like Charles Ingalls, Miles Cooper, John Bardell, and Benjamin Moore. These are all prominent Anglicans in New York, and they were all loyalists. They have a rich correspondence that goes on throughout the revolution. Miles Cooper leaves in 1775. People think he's going to be tarred and feathered, and then he eventually escapes and it settles in Edinburgh. And he has a correspondence with people like Seabury, people like Ingalls, and they talk about the revolution, how they think it's a Presbyterian war. And they describe it as a religious war, because they see people like MacDougall, Presbyterian, John Moran Scott, Presbyterian, and they think it's motivated because of that. That might be a part of it, but I don't think it's the main part of it. But these people are people, they are loyalists that people often associate with loyalism. Anglican ministers, they're kind of separated from the everyday colonist or the everyday New Yorker. They definitely constitute an important part of loyalism in New York. As I said, more Anglicans were loyalists than any other. But it's a small percentage in the grand scheme of things. What is really interesting is that after the British retake New York in 1776, you start to see sort of various British names pop up in the baptismal record. So you have like Henry Clinton, surname, Henry Clinton, the British general, or you have like Anne Britannia, Britannia being the middle name. And I'm like, oh, wow, these people are really serious about their Britishness and their loyalism. And I documented all this in a database that I have, but they're not just the only two examples. Like lots of people start to name their children after prominent British figures in British history, even contemporary figures like Henry Clinton. If they're born a few years later, they might not have been called Henry Clinton, but it's something that I would like to explore further. The problem that I found in looking up and comparing loyalist religions in New York is that there were more sources available for Anglicans than any other. So the data that I have is skewed heavily in favor. Because I have more sources, I'm going to be able to pin them down. But I did find loyalists who were Presbyterian, who were Quakers, who were Lutherans, but it's a much smaller number. That's thanks in part to the archivists at Trinity Church putting materials online, which I'm very grateful for.
Great, thank you. And one question to bring it home here: where can everybody buy your book besides Amazon?
Besides Cornell University Press's website, you can buy it there. It's also available on Audible now. It just came out last week as an audiobook, and it's the cheapest version. So I would encourage people to look at that. It's also available as an ebook that you can buy as well. And for people here, it's also available on the back table.
Very good. Dr. Minty, I want to thank you for coming out and speaking for us tonight. Thank you all for attending in person and for online as well, and for all of your support of our mission. So we will see you next time. So everybody get home safe. Take care and have a good night.